The lights went out just after the sunset turned the city into its usual constellation of artificial stars. Only this time, the darkness didn't recede. It swallowed everything whole. The skyline of New York, which once gleamed defiantly against the winter nights, had become a hollow outline. For the first time, I saw the city as it must have been long before us. Silent, overwhelming, and indifferent. The cold seeped in almost immediately. We didn't realize it at first. Everyone was too busy scrambling for flashlights, checking phones, and wondering when the grid would flicker back to life. By the time I noticed my breath fogging in the dim glow of a lantern, the hospital already felt more like a tomb. It wasn't much of a hospital, really. A few rooms in what used to be an office building, hastily converted when the real hospitals overflowed weeks ago. Supplies were rationed. Heat was a luxury. But it was a place, our place, a fragile refuge against a world we no longer understood. I remember Alex clearly that night. Her face was sharp, angular, illuminated only by the faint light of a headlamp. She moved through the makeshift ward with a kind of calm urgency, her voice steady but clipped as she gave instructions. She was a nurse, not by training but by necessity, and the closest thing we had to a leader. "We need to keep everyone in one place," she said, her words cutting through the nervous murmur of voices. "Close off the unused rooms, conserve the heat." The murmurs grew louder, objections rising like steam. Someone, Paul, I think, argued about his family needing space. Someone else mentioned the food. The rations were low, and tempers were lower. Alex didn't flinch. "Do you want to survive the night?" she asked, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Then you'll do as I say." I kept quiet, clutching a blanket around my shoulders. The cold made it hard to think, the edges of my thoughts dulled by the relentless ache in my hands and feet. Then came the news. It arrived in pieces, whispered between those who dared to venture outside and those of us too scared to leave. "They're faster now," one man said, his voice trembling. And quieter. I tried to dismiss it as rumor, but something in his eyes made me shiver in a way the cold hadn't. Alex didn't react. She just kept moving, kept organizing. That was her gift, I suppose, her ability to keep going when the rest of us froze. But even she couldn't ignore the first scream. It came from the far end of the building, where the generator room was supposed to be. A single sound, sharp and desperate, cut off too quickly. We didn't move at first. No one wanted to be the one to step into the hallway. Then Alex grabbed her flashlight, her jaw set, and started walking. She didn't look back to see if we'd follow. I stayed behind. It wasn't courage that kept me rooted to my spot. It was fear, plain and simple. Whatever was out there in the dark, I didn't want to meet it. When Alex returned, her face was pale, and her hands trembled as she gripped the flashlight. "The generator's gone," she said, her voice quieter now. "And so is Kevin." No one spoke. The silence felt heavier than the dark pressing in from outside. That was the moment I realized we weren't just trying to survive the cold. We were surviving something else. Something we couldn't see. Something that didn't need light to find us. Night in the city had always held a kind of restless energy, even in its darkest corners. But now, stripped of its ceaseless hum, New York felt as though it were holding its breath. Silence filled every crevice, magnifying the smallest of sounds. The creak of a settling floorboard, the faint scuff of shoes on tile, the low groan of a building adjusting to the cold. The whispers came first. Not voices exactly, more like the suggestion of movement in the periphery, just beyond the reach of our flickering lanterns. First, I thought it was my imagination. Lack of sleep, the gnawing ache of hunger, the relentless cold. They all played tricks on the mind. But when others began to glance nervously toward the same corners of the room, I knew I wasn't alone. By the second night, we'd set up a rotation for the watch. The plan was simple. 2 people stationed at the windows overlooking the street, scanning for movement, while the rest of us huddled together in the central room. The hospital had become more of a fortress than a place of healing, though even that felt like wishful thinking. Paul was on watch that night, along with a woman named Carla. She was wiry, quick to anger, but dependable when it mattered. They had taken up their positions near the front windows, their flashlights trained on the darkened street below. I could hear them murmuring to each other, their voices low but steady, a sound I clung to like a lifeline. The attack was so sudden that at first, I thought I'd imagined it. A crash of breaking glass, a sharp, guttural cry, and then nothing. We ran toward the sound, our footsteps echoing in the hallway. Alex was already ahead of us, her flashlight cutting through the dark like a blade. The front windows were shattered, shards of glass glinting faintly in the dim light. Paul lay crumpled on the floor, his head turned at an unnatural angle. Carla was gone. Alex didn't waste time. "Back to the central room," she ordered, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Now, we moved as one, a ragged group clutching blankets and makeshift weapons, anything that might offer a shred of protection. The central room felt smaller now, its walls pressing in as the reality of what we faced began to sink in. "They're faster than we thought," Alex said, her tone matter-of-fact but laced with urgency. "And they're quiet. They know how to wait." "What do we do?" someone asked, their voice breaking. Alex hesitated for only a moment. "We restore the power," she said. The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. We all knew what she meant. The dam on the edge of the city was our only hope, a chance to bring back the lights, the heat, and maybe some semblance of safety. But it wasn't close, and the journey there would take us through the very streets we were trying to avoid. "That's suicide," Paul's brother, Tom, said. "It's survival," Alex shot back. The room erupted into debate. Some were adamant that staying put was the only option. Others, driven by desperation, clung to Alex's plan as if it were a lifeline. I stayed silent, my mind racing through every possibility and finding none of them comforting. In the end, Alex didn't wait for consensus. "I'm going," she said, her voice firm. "Anyone who wants to live is welcome to join me." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words pressing down on us. In the darkened corners of the hospital, I thought I heard the faintest hint of movement, a whisper of something waiting, watching. Whatever choice we made, the city wouldn't let us rest. The hospital was always cold now, its chill sinking deeper with each passing hour, but that morning it seemed colder still. Tensions crackled through the air like static electricity, the kind you could almost feel humming on your skin. The night's attack had stolen more than a life. It had taken what fragile peace we had managed to cobble together. "We can't just walk into the city," Tom was saying, his voice rising with each word. "It's suicide. You all saw what happened to Carla, to Paul." His face was red, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "And what's the alternative?" Alex replied, her tone sharp but steady. "Sit here and wait for them to pick us off one by one? We're safe here." Alex's laugh was bitter, cutting through the din. "Are we?" "Tell that to Paul, to Carla. This hospital isn't a fortress. It's a tomb." The room erupted into noise, arguments layered on top of each other, voices raised in anger and fear. I sat near the edge of the group, my back pressed against the cold wall, watching the scene unfold. There was an energy to it, desperate and chaotic, as though we were all teetering on the edge of something far worse than the infected outside. Riley, the youngest among us, finally broke through the clamor. She was barely out of her teens, but her voice carried more resolve than most of the adults in the room. "Alex is right," she said. "If we stay, we're done. You saw what happened last night. They're getting smarter, bolder. It's only a matter of time before they find a way in." "And what exactly do you think you'll accomplish out there?" Tom spat back. "Power," Marcus said. His voice was low, steady, a stark contrast to the shouting match around him. Marcus was an ex-cop, built like a tank, with a face that rarely betrayed emotion. "If we can get the dam running again, it changes the game. Heat, lights, security. It's the only shot we've got." Tom's laugh was hollow. "You think a handful of people can do what an entire city failed to? Good luck." "Then stay here," Alex said sharply. "Stay and see how long you last." "But I'm not sitting around waiting to die." The room fell quiet at her words, the weight of the decision settling over us like a heavy blanket. Slowly, the group began to fracture. Some stayed with Tom, their fear anchoring them to the hospital. Others gravitated toward Alex, drawn to the thin thread of hope she offered, no matter how perilous the plan. In the end, the team was small. Alex, of course, leading the charge. Marcus, whose quiet strength was a comfort even in the face of overwhelming odds. Riley, whose mechanical skills had already saved us more than once. And Dr. Lin, a retired physician who had spent decades stitching up wounds far worse than the ones we'd seen here. I watched as they gathered what supplies they could: flashlights, canned food, a map hastily sketched on the back of an old chart. The rest of us hovered nearby, unwilling to join but unable to look away. When the time came for them to leave, the goodbyes were awkward and brief. Riley hugged a few of the others, her movements stiff, as though the gesture was more habit than genuine connection. Marcus simply nodded, his face as impassive as ever. It was Dr. Lin who surprised us all. He turned back at the door, his weathered face calm but resolute. "Stay safe," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had seen more than his share of danger. "And if we don't come back, find another way." The group disappeared into the shadows of the hallway, their footsteps fading into the stillness of the hospital. For a long time after they left, no one spoke. The silence was oppressive, heavy with the weight of everything unspoken. It wasn't until much later, as I sat staring out the window into the endless dark, that I realized how much quieter the city had become. It wasn't just the absence of traffic or voices. It was the absence of us. The city felt unrecognizable. The snow, pristine and untouched, blanketed everything, softening edges and muting sounds. It was a cruel disguise, masking the decay beneath with its false purity. Buildings loomed over us like silent sentinels, their windows shattered, their facades pocked with the marks of panic and violence. Somewhere in the distance, a faint echo, a car alarm or a scream, reminded us that the city was still alive in its own terrible way. Alex led the way, her flashlight sweeping across the ground. Every step was deliberate, each crunch of snow underfoot a reminder of how exposed we were. Times Square had always been a place of light and noise, of crowds and spectacle. Now it was a graveyard of forgotten billboards, their neon messages reduced to silent, static displays. The air was sharp and cold, biting through layers of clothing. Riley walked close to me, her eyes darting toward every shadow, her breath visible in short, nervous puffs. Dr. Lin trudged behind us, his bag of medical supplies slung over one shoulder. Marcus brought up the rear, his hand never straying far from the crowbar strapped to his side. As we approached the heart of the square, Alex raised a hand, signaling for us to stop. At first, I couldn't see what had caught her attention. Then the light shifted and I understood. They were everywhere, crouched in unnatural poses, their heads tilted at strange angles, their limbs folded in ways that made my stomach churn. The infected, dormant in the cold, their breaths slow and shallow, exhaled faint wisps of steam that hung in the frozen air. Snow dusted their hair and shoulders, making them look like grotesque statues left behind in a forgotten park. Alex motioned for us to move around them, keeping to the edges of the square. It was a delicate operation, weaving through the maze of debris and frozen bodies. Every muscle in my body ached with tension, my heart pounding loud enough that I was sure they could hear it. We were nearly through when it happened. A shard of glass, hidden beneath the snow, crunched beneath Riley's boot. The sound wasn't loud, but in the silence, it was deafening. The closest infected twitched, its head snapping upright. For a moment, it didn't move, its milky eyes scanning the air as though searching for the source of the sound. Then it rose, too quickly, its limbs jerking like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. And then, as though awakened by some terrible signal, the others began to stir. "Run," Alex hissed, and we did. The square erupted into chaos, the infected surging toward us with a speed that defied their frozen stillness moments earlier. Their movements were erratic but terrifyingly fast, their shrieks cutting through the night like knives. We darted through the streets, slipping on patches of ice, stumbling over debris. My lungs burned from the effort, the cold air slicing my throat with every gasp. Behind me, I could hear Marcus shouting, a warning or a command. I couldn't tell. We reached an alley and Alex pushed Riley through first, then me. Marcus was just behind us when one of them lunged, its claws catching his arm. He swung his crowbar in a wide arc, the force of the blow knocking the creature back, but not before it left a jagged gash across his forearm. "Go!" he bellowed, his face twisted in pain. Dr. Lin was already pulling him forward, his hands steady despite the chaos around us. The alley was narrow and dark, a choke point that forced the infected to funnel in one by one. Marcus turned and swung again, his crowbar connecting with sickening force. When we finally emerged on the other side, the infected had fallen behind, their shrieks fading into the distance. We didn't stop until we were sure they weren't following, collapsing against a rusted chain-link fence that bordered an overgrown lot. Marcus sank to the ground, clutching his arm. Blood seeped through his jacket, staining the snow beneath him. "Let me see," Dr. Lin said, kneeling beside him. His voice was calm, but his hands moved quickly, pulling supplies from his bag. Alex stood guard, her flashlight scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Riley was shaking, her breaths shallow and erratic. I knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We made it," I said, though the words felt hollow. But Riley didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on Marcus, her expression caught somewhere between relief and dread. The tower loomed in the distance, a jagged silhouette against the pale light of the moon. Its upper floors were shattered, like a wound in the skyline, but the lower levels seemed intact, enough to promise shelter, at least for a night. We reached the entrance after a grueling trek through icy streets, Marcus's injuries slowing our pace. Alex tested the door, her movements cautious, but it swung open with a low groan that echoed unnervingly in the empty street. Inside, the air was colder than it had been outside, as though the concrete walls trapped the winter chill. Dust coated every surface, and shards of broken glass crunched under our boots. The lobby had once been grand, with marble floors and high ceilings, but now it was a desolate cavern. "Upstairs," Alex said, her voice low. "Higher ground means better visibility." We climbed cautiously, our footsteps muffled by layers of debris. The stairwell was narrow and oppressive, the dim light from our flashlights barely enough to guide the way. Marcus leaned heavily on Dr. Lin, his face pale and drawn. By the time we reached the 10th floor, we were exhausted. The space was empty except for a few broken desks and overturned chairs, but it was secure. Alex barricaded the door while Riley and I checked the windows. The city stretched out below us, dark and lifeless, its once vibrant energy extinguished. As I turned back, I froze. A figure stood at the far end of the room, partially hidden in the shadows. "Who's there?" Alex demanded, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife at her belt. The man stepped forward slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. He was tall and wiry, with unkempt hair and clothes that hung loosely from his frame. His eyes, sharp and calculating, darted between us. "Ethan," he said simply, "I've been here for weeks. Thought I was the only one left." His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, something I couldn't quite place. Alex didn't lower her guard. "How do we know we can trust you?" Ethan shrugged, his expression unreadable. "You don't. But if I wanted to harm you, I wouldn't have waited until you saw me." The logic was cold, but it made sense. After a tense discussion, we agreed to let him stay, on the condition that he remain unarmed. Ethan seemed indifferent, handing over a small blade without argument. As night fell, we gathered around a small, makeshift lantern that Riley had managed to cobble together from scavenged parts. The flickering light cast long shadows on the walls, making the room feel even larger and emptier. Ethan sat slightly apart from the rest of us, his posture relaxed but his eyes constantly moving. "You've seen them, haven't you?" he asked suddenly, breaking the heavy silence. Alex nodded. "The infected? Yes. Too many of them." Ethan leaned forward, his face illuminated by the dim glow. "Then you know how they hunt." "They're fast," Alex said, her tone cautious. "And relentless." "They're blind," Ethan said, his voice flat, "but their hearing makes up for it. They can hear your breath from across a room, the sound of a shoe on glass, the creak of a floorboard. They don't miss anything." A chill ran through me, colder than the air around us. The memory of the infected in Times Square, their heads snapping toward the slightest sound, replayed in my mind. "How do you know that?" Riley asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's expression darkened. "Because I've seen what happens when you make noise. They don't stop until they find you. And if one hears you," he paused, glancing toward the barricaded door, "the others come running." The room fell silent, each of us processing his words. "You're saying there's no way to fight them?" Marcus asked, wincing as he shifted his position. "You don't fight them," Ethan replied. "You avoid them. Stay quiet, stay out of sight. Anything else is suicide." It was a grim assessment, but it rang true. That night, sleep was elusive. Every creak of the building, every distant sound from the streets below, set my nerves on edge. I found myself watching Ethan more than I wanted to, studying his every move, searching for signs of deceit. He sat by the window, staring out at the city, his face a mask of quiet contemplation. I wondered what he saw out there, if he still saw hope, or if he had already resigned himself to the darkness. The entrance to the subway was like the mouth of some great beast, a gaping void descending into a darkness we could not fully comprehend. The air below was colder than I anticipated, carrying with it the damp, metallic tang of a place forgotten by time and humanity alike. Ethan led the way, his movements confident yet measured, as though he had walked these tunnels 100 times before. "Stay close," he murmured, his voice barely audible, "and step where I step. These tunnels amplify sound." The faint light of our flashlights caught the glint of steel rails, their surfaces dulled by frost and disuse. The silence down there was suffocating, broken only by the soft shuffle of our feet and the occasional drip of water from unseen cracks above. Riley lingered near the back of the group, her gaze darting between the shadows that seemed to swell and shift around us. She had been quieter than usual since our time in the tower, her usual sarcastic remarks replaced by a grim determination. "Why the subway?" Marcus asked, his voice low but tense. "They can't see down here," Ethan replied, not breaking his stride. "Their hearing's sharp, but the echoes confused them. It's our best shot at avoiding them entirely." But even his calm certainty did little to quell the sense of unease that clung to me like a second skin. We moved deeper, the tunnel widening into a cavernous station. The remnants of a chaotic exodus were everywhere. Overturned benches, abandoned bags, and scattered shoes that seemed to have been shed in panicked haste. "Something's wrong," Alex whispered, her hand tightening around the crowbar she carried. The air felt heavier here, as though the shadows themselves were waiting. My flashlight beam swept across the platform, illuminating fragments of graffiti and cracked tiles. Then it landed on something else, something wrong. A figure stood motionless at the far end of the station, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. For a moment, I thought it was one of us, another survivor frozen by fear. But then the figure twitched, its movements jerky and inhuman. Before I could warn the others, it lunged forward with terrifying speed. "Run!" Alex shouted, her voice cutting through the silence like a whip. The tunnel erupted into chaos. More figures emerged from the shadows, their movements predatory and soundless. They poured from the stairwells and burst through side corridors, a flood of terror that seemed to come from nowhere. Riley was the first to act. She grabbed Marcus, who was lagging behind, and shoved him forward. "Go!" she barked, her voice steadier than I expected. We ran blindly into the darkness, our breaths ragged and our footsteps thunderous against the concrete floor. The infected gave chase, their silhouettes a blur of motion at the edges of the flashlight beams. "This way," Ethan yelled, veering sharply into a maintenance tunnel. The passage was narrower and more treacherous, the walls lined with pipes that hissed and groaned underfoot. Alex and I pushed forward, practically dragging Marcus between us. Then I realized Riley wasn't behind us. "Where is she?" I gasped, turning back. "She stayed behind," Ethan said grimly. "No!" I tried to turn around, but Alex grabbed my arm, her grip ironclad. "She knew what she was doing," Alex said, her voice breaking. I wanted to believe her, but the sound of something distant, a sharp burst of noise, like metal striking stone, confirmed my worst fears. Later, when we finally stopped to catch our breath, Ethan broke the silence. "She bought us time," he said, his tone matter of fact. "It's what we needed," but his words did little to ease the hollow ache spreading in my chest. The next morning, we found a spot to rest in another section of the subway, the infected seemingly unable to follow us into the tight confines. None of us spoke much. Even Marcus, who owed Riley his life, stared blankly at the ground, his lips pressed into a thin line. Alex was the first to break the silence. "She was the best of us." The statement hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the sound of Riley's laugh, her endless tinkering and her unshakable confidence. But all I could see was the moment she turned back, the resolve in her eyes as she faced what was coming. It was a sacrifice none of us deserved. The city had been relentless in its attempts to swallow us whole, but nothing compared to the sight awaiting us at the river's edge. The bridge, once an unwavering symbol of connection between the city and the dam, lay in ruins. Concrete slabs jutted at jagged angles, their steel reinforcements twisted like broken limbs. Snow had settled into the crevices, lending the devastation an eerie stillness. Below, the river churned with icy malevolence, its surface a mosaic of fractured ice flows. For a moment, none of us spoke. "How far to the dam from here?" Alex asked, breaking the silence. Ethan squinted into the distance. "It's close, but we'll have to cross this." He gestured toward the fractured remains of the bridge. Marcus let out a low, humorless laugh. "Of course we will." The precarious crossing stretched before us, the remains of the bridge forming a crude path of broken beams and crumbling concrete. It wasn't a question of bravery but necessity. If we didn't make it to the dam, the hospital, and everyone still there would freeze to death. "Stay together," Alex instructed, her voice firm. Ethan went first, his movements measured and deliberate as he tested each step. The rest of us followed, the jagged edges of the ruins biting at our hands and scraping against our boots. Every sound felt magnified in the oppressive quiet. The crunch of snow, the groan of stressed steel, the occasional cough that we tried to muffle. Halfway across, the attack came. It started with a low, guttural sound, somewhere between a growl and a hiss. Then, from the shadows of the broken structure, they emerged. The infected moved with terrifying speed, their twisted forms barely human. They climbed the wreckage with an agility that defied reason, their silence making their sudden appearance even more horrifying. "Move!" Alex shouted, her voice cutting through the panic. The narrow path became a battleground. Ethan swung a length of pipe he had picked up earlier, his strikes brutal and efficient. Alex brandished her crowbar, its heavy blows connecting with sickening thuds. Marcus shoved one of the creatures off the edge, its form disappearing into the icy abyss below. But they kept coming. One of them lunged toward me, its hands clawing at my jacket. I swung wildly with my flashlight, the beam slicing through the dark and momentarily disorienting it. Alex was there in an instant, finishing it off with a decisive strike. "Keep going," she yelled. As we scrambled toward the far end of the bridge, the chaos intensified. The infected were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. I caught a glimpse of Marcus, his face twisted in pain as he shoved another one away. Blood streaked his sleeve, but he didn't call for help. By the time we reached the other side, we were battered and gasping, our breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Ethan collapsed against a concrete barrier, his hands trembling as he wiped blood. His or theirs? I couldn't tell, off his face. Alex did a head count, her eyes scanning each of us with a ferocity that matched the desperation of our situation. "Everyone here?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Yeah," Marcus grunted, cradling his arm. I caught the look in his eyes, a flicker of something he tried to hide. But in the chaos, no one questioned it. The dam loomed in the distance, its massive structure a stark silhouette against the dimming light. It should have felt like a victory, reaching this place. Instead, it felt like a temporary reprieve, a moment to catch our breath before the next nightmare began. "We need to move," Ethan said, his voice hoarse. "The longer we stay here, the more vulnerable we are." But none of us moved right away. Exhaustion had seeped into our bones, the weight of Riley's loss and the narrow escape draining what little resolve we had left. As we finally began the climb toward the dam, I glanced back at Marcus. His steps were steady, his expression stoic. But his hands stayed pressed against his arm, blood staining the fabric beneath it. I didn't say anything. Not yet. The dam rose before us like a fortress, its towering walls weathered but enduring. Snow whipped through the air, carried by a biting wind that seemed intent on driving us back. Yet, despite its foreboding presence, the dam felt like salvation, at least for a moment. Inside, the reality was starkly different. The air was colder than outside, the stone walls leaching any warmth that might have lingered. Shadows dominated every corner, cast by flickering emergency lights powered by some weak, residual energy. Machinery loomed in the gloom, silent and lifeless, their once vital hum replaced by a pervasive stillness. Ethan led the way, his flashlight carving a path through the darkened corridors. "The control room should be ahead," he muttered, his breath visible in the freezing air. Alex walked beside him, her grip tight on her crowbar. Dr. Lin and I trailed close behind, each of us shivering from cold and exhaustion. Marcus brought up the rear, silent and grim, his face pale beneath the bruises and scrapes from the bridge. When we reached the control room, hope surged briefly. Panels blinked weakly, and a low hum indicated some systems still functioned. Ethan immediately set to work, his fingers deft as they navigated the controls. "This isn't good," he muttered after a few minutes. "What's wrong?" Alex asked, leaning over his shoulder. "The main power grid is offline. It looks like someone sabotaged it. Wires cut, components damaged." He pointed to a shattered panel. This wasn't just neglect. Someone didn't want this place running. The weight of his words settled heavily in the room. "Can we fix it?" Alex pressed. "Maybe," Ethan said, glancing at the rest of us. "But it's gonna take time, and we're gonna need parts from the lower levels." "Then we better get started," she replied, her tone firm despite the tension etched on her face. We divided the tasks. Ethan and Alex focused on assessing the damage in the control room, while Dr. Lin and I scavenged nearby storage areas for tools and spare components. Marcus stayed close, his role undefined but his presence a necessity in the event of danger. The cold gnawed at us relentlessly. My fingers ached as I rummaged through boxes, my breath shallow from the freezing air. Dr. Lin, despite his age, worked with steady determination, his medical bag slung over one shoulder. It wasn't long before the first attack came. A distant sound, metal clanging against stone, echoed through the dam's labyrinthine halls. At first, we froze, uncertain if it was just the shifting of the structure or something more sinister. Then the unmistakable sound of footsteps, rapid and purposeful, shattered any illusions of safety. "They're here," Marcus said grimly, gripping a heavy wrench he had picked up earlier. The infected came in waves, their movements erratic but terrifyingly efficient. They poured into the corridors, their forms barely visible in the dim light but unmistakable in their intent. Marcus moved without hesitation, his injuries seemingly forgotten in the chaos. He swung his wrench with brutal precision, each strike buying us precious seconds to retreat. "This way," Alex shouted, motioning toward a narrow stairwell. We followed her, the tight space forcing the infected to come at us one at a time. Marcus stayed at the rear, his strikes slowing them down but never stopping them completely. It was on the stairwell landing that he faltered. One of the creatures lunged, its claws catching his arm, the same arm he had been cradling since the bridge. He grunted in pain, shoving it back with a strength that seemed to come from sheer willpower. "Go," he barked, his voice a command that brooked no argument. "Marcus, no," Alex shouted, turning back, but he stopped her with a look. "There's no time," he said, his voice steady despite the blood staining his sleeve. "I'll hold them off. Get to the control room and finish this. Marcus, go." Ethan grabbed Alex's arm, pulling her away. "We have to move," he insisted. With a final glance, we fled, Marcus's figure disappearing into the shadows as he faced the oncoming horde. The sounds of his struggle followed us. Metal against flesh, grunts of effort, and finally silence. When we reached the control room, the weight of his sacrifice was unbearable. Alex's hands trembled as she resumed the repairs, her face pale but determined. Ethan worked beside her, his focus razor-sharp. Dr. Lin stood by the door, his eyes scanning the hallway for any signs of pursuit. "We're running out of time," Ethan muttered, his voice low. "We finish this," Alex replied, her tone hard despite the tears that glistened in her eyes. "For Marcus, for Riley, for everyone, the dam, once our refuge, had become our battleground." And even as we worked, the shadows around us seemed to deepen, a constant reminder that we were far from safe. The stillness in the control room felt brittle, as though the weight of Marcus's absence had settled over us, thick and unyielding. Alex worked in silence, her movements mechanical but purposeful. Ethan hovered nearby, his gaze darting between the dimly lit corridors and the fragile circuitry he tried to revive. Dr. Lin stood by the doorway, his posture tense, watching as the shadows crept ever closer. It was the faintest tremor in Ethan's voice that set everything into motion. "This should have worked by now," he muttered, his tone tinged with something too sharp to be frustration. It sounded like regret. Alex froze, her hand gripping the edge of the panel she was repairing. She turned slowly, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean, should've?" Ethan hesitated, his gaze flickering away. He looked like a man cornered, his body betraying a readiness to bolt even though there was nowhere to run. "Spit it out," Alex demanded, her voice low and dangerous. Dr. Lin stepped closer, his measured tone a counterpoint to Alex's rising fury. "Ethan, if there's something you're not telling us, now's the time. Lives depend on it." The silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, Ethan sighed, the sound hollow in the cold, cavernous space. "I didn't tell you everything about this place," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Alex crossed her arms, her jaw tight. "Start talking." Ethan swallowed hard, his fingers fidgeting with the flashlight in his hands. "Before all this started, I was part of a group, engineers, technicians, and a few politicians. When the infection first broke out, panic spread faster than the disease. People were desperate, violent. My group, We decided to take precautions. What kind of precautions? Alex asked, though her tone suggested she already knew she wouldn't like the answer. Ethan's shoulders sagged. We sabotaged the dam. We thought if we cut off power to the surrounding areas, it would isolate the infected, slow the spread. Give our families a chance to escape. Dr. Lin inhaled sharply. Alex's expression darkened, a mixture of disbelief and fury taking hold. You what? She hissed, stepping closer to him. It wasn't supposed to be permanent. Ethan's voice cracked, rising in desperation. We thought we could come back, fix it once the danger passed. But things got worse, faster than anyone expected. The infected overwhelmed the city before we could do anything. And then my group, he trailed off, his eyes distant. They're all gone. I'm the only one left. Alex's fists clenched at her sides. Do you realize what you've done? How many people you condemned with that decision? I was trying to save my family. Ethan shot back, his voice raw. I didn't know. None of us knew it would turn out like this. The room erupted into a cacophony of anger and accusations. Alex's voice rang out, sharp and unrelenting. While Ethan tried to defend himself, his words increasingly frantic. Dr. Lin finally intervened, his tone firm but calm. Enough, he said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a scalpel. We don't have time for this. Alex turned on him, her eyes blazing. How can you be so calm? He's the reason we're in this mess. And if we don't finish these repairs, none of it will matter, Dr. Lin countered, his gaze steady. The infected don't care about blame, Alex. They'll kill us all the same. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of machinery, barely audible over the howling wind outside. Ethan lowered his head, his voice barely audible. I'll fix this. Whatever it takes, I'll make it right. Alex didn't respond immediately. Her breathing was heavy, her hands trembling as she tried to rein in her emotions. Finally, she turned back to the panel, her movements stiff and deliberate. Fine, she said through gritted teeth. But you don't get to make any more decisions. You follow my lead, or so help me. I'll leave you here to deal with the infected on your own. Ethan nodded, his expression a mixture of shame and determination. Dr. Lin placed a hand on Alex's shoulder, a small gesture of solidarity. We need to move forward, he said quietly. For Marcus, for Riley, for everyone who's counting on us. Alex didn't respond, but she didn't pull away either. The shadows around us seemed to grow darker as we resumed our work, the tension between us palpable. Ethan's revelations hung in the air like a specter, a reminder of the choices that had brought us to this point, and the consequences we would all have to face. Somewhere in the distance, a faint sound echoed, a reminder that the infected were never far behind. The air inside the dam felt electric with tension, the sound of our breathing drowned out by the low, insistent thrum of the infected massing outside. The howls of the creatures grew louder with each passing moment, a grotesque symphony of hunger and rage echoing through the cold stone walls. Alex worked furiously at the main console, her fingers moving with a precision that belied the tremble in her hands. Dr. Lin hovered over her, offering quiet instructions, his usually calm demeanor strained but unbroken. Ethan had taken to fortifying the doors, dragging debris and broken machinery into crude barricades. They're close, he muttered, his voice tight. We've got minutes, maybe less. Alex didn't look up. Then we don't have time for doubts. Is the system ready? Dr. Lin hesitated. We're missing a key connection. Without it, the grid won't stabilize and the power will fail again. Alex turned to him, her eyes wide and desperate. "Where is it?" Lynn pointed toward a set of stairs that spiraled downward into the bowels of the dam. "Control room B. But if the infected breach before we finish," the unspoken words hung in the air, "it would be over." Ethan adjusted the grip on the crowbar he'd been carrying, his knuckles white. "I'll go." "No," Alex snapped. "We're sticking together." Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but the decision was made for them. A deafening crash reverberated through the dam as the infected hit the outer barricades. The force of their assault rattled the walls, dust and debris raining down from above. "Go!" Alex shouted, shoving Ethan toward the stairs. "Lynn and I will hold them off." Dr. Lynn hesitated, his eyes darting between Alex and Ethan. "Alex, just go," she barked. Ethan bolted, disappearing down the staircase, his footsteps swallowed by the cacophony of the attack. Alex and Dr. Lynn scrambled to reinforce the inner barricade, but the infected were relentless. The first wave burst through the outer doors, their forms a blur of ragged flesh and snapping jaws. "They're here," Lynn shouted, grabbing a wrench to defend himself. Alex's heart pounded as she swung a metal pipe at the first creature to breach the barricade. The impact sent it sprawling, but another took its place, and then another. They were faster than she'd imagined, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. "Lynn, fall back," she yelled, her voice barely audible over the chaos. They retreated toward the control panel, using every second to buy Ethan the time he needed. The infected swarmed, their grotesque forms illuminated by the flickering emergency lights. A sudden roar of machinery filled the air. Ethan's voice crackled through the intercom. "I've got the connection. Hit the main switch." Alex didn't hesitate. She lunged for the console, her fingers flying over the controls. The infected were almost upon her, their clawed hands reaching. Dr. Lynn swung his wrench with desperate strength, but it wasn't enough. "Alex!" he screamed, just as she slammed the final switch into place. The dam roared to life, the hum of electricity surging through its veins like a heartbeat. Floodlights blazed outside, their harsh brilliance stunning the infected. For a moment, they froze, their grotesque faces contorted in confusion. Alex and Lynn didn't wait to see what happened next. They fled toward the staircase, joining Ethan just as the infected regained their senses. "We did it," Ethan panted, his face a mixture of relief and terror. Alex didn't share his optimism. "Not yet. We need to hold them off until the grid stabilizes." The three of them turned to face the horde, their backs to the control room door. The infected poured in, their numbers overwhelming. Alex gripped her pipe tightly, her breath steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "This is it," she muttered, her voice steel. "We fight or we die." And then, with a cry that echoed through the dam, she charged forward, leading the others into the fray. The light came in a flood, a burst of brightness that seemed to tear the world apart, stripping it bare. For a moment, everything was white, a radiant brilliance that blotted out the darkness that had clung to the city like a living thing. Then, slowly, as if the very air itself had to adjust, the harsh glow settled into something more familiar. The familiar pulse of the streetlights, the flicker of neon signs that had been dead for so long. The lights of New York had returned. Alex staggered back, her breath caught in her throat, as she looked through the cracked windows of the dam. The city was alive again, in a way. The infected, disoriented by the sudden flood of light, stumbled backward, their movements jerky, confused. They screeched, their senses overwhelmed, as if the light itself were a weapon they didn't understand. But it wasn't enough yet. Alex could feel it in the pit of her stomach. The power had returned, yes, but it would be temporary. The city's pulse, so to speak, was fragile, and the dam's infrastructure was already showing signs of strain. "They're retreating," Ethan shouted, his voice breaking through her thoughts. But Alex didn't share his relief. Her eyes darted toward the control panel, where she could see the first signs of the power grid beginning to flicker. The lights outside would not last. She knew that much. They had mere minutes, maybe seconds, to get out. "Alex!" Ethan's voice was louder now, more urgent. He grabbed her arm, shaking her out of her reverie. "We need to go. Now!" Her gaze shifted to Dr. Lin, who had already started toward the control room again. "Lin," she called, her voice tight. "We need to leave." But Dr. Lin didn't stop. His face was set with determination, his hands already working furiously at the controls, his back to them as he adjusted the intricate system. "I can't leave," Lin said without turning. "If this fails, I'll keep the system stable. You need to go." Alex felt a pang of guilt twist inside her, but it was quickly replaced by a cold nod of understanding. Lin was right. This was the only chance they had. They couldn't stay. "We'll come back for you," she shouted, her voice tight with the weight of what she knew. Lin didn't answer, and she couldn't bring herself to look back as she turned toward the staircase. Ethan followed her without a word. The steps echoed as they descended quickly, their boots scraping against the cold concrete. Outside, the light was both their salvation and their danger. The infected were still confused, but they were adapting. The shock of the light would wear off soon. They didn't have long. Alex moved quickly, the pounding of her heart nearly deafening in her ears. She didn't stop to look at Ethan, at the city, or at the wreckage that had once been home. The only thing that mattered now was getting out. As they reached the street level, Alex paused only long enough to catch her breath. The sight before them made her stomach turn. The city, once vibrant, once alive, was now a monstrous version of itself, its soul stripped away. The streets were empty, save for the wreckage and the scattered bodies of the dead. And the dead, the infected, they were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next moment of weakness. Ethan grabbed her arm again, pulling her forward. "We need to get to the outskirts now, before they regroup." Alex nodded, her resolve firming as she stepped forward. But the sight of the chaos, the devastation, was overwhelming. For a second, she almost couldn't breathe, as if the air itself were choking her. She had just wanted to survive, to hold on to something. But now, what was the point? But she couldn't afford to think like that. Not anymore. They ran, their footsteps echoing in the empty streets. For all the distance between them and the dam, Alex couldn't escape the feeling that the city itself was closing in. The light was a fragile thing, and she could feel the darkness pulling at her heels. They reached the outskirts of the city. Alex paused for just a moment, looking back. She could barely make out the silhouette of the dam against the skyline, its shape now a dark shadow in the distance. The lights were still on. For now, Ethan didn't stop. He kept moving, his face grim, but his determination never wavered. "Let's keep moving," he urged, his voice quiet but firm. Alex nodded, the weight of everything still pressing on her chest. They hadn't won. Not yet. They had only delayed the inevitable. The world was still falling apart. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Alex allowed herself a single breath, a moment of peace. They had survived the night, and that, for now, would have to be enough. The journey back to the hospital felt different, though the path was the same. The air was cold, crisp with the weight of silence that hung over the city like a shroud. The lights of New York, still flickering in their fragile glow, cast long shadows across the empty streets. The chaos, the terror, the screams. Those memories clung to the streets, the buildings, even the broken windows. But there was something else now. Something new, though faint and fragile. Alex walked with a heavy heart, her boots crunching in the snow that seemed to cover everything, hiding the damage and the despair. Ethan walked beside her, his presence steady, like an anchor in a world that no longer made sense. They didn't speak much on the way back, but the weight of everything, the losses, the choices, the fear, hung between them like a veil. There was nothing to say that would make it better. Nothing to ease the raw, jagged pain of it all. The hospital loomed ahead, a strange, quiet fortress. As they crossed the threshold, Alex could almost feel the weight lift slightly from her shoulders. The lights inside were dim, flickering just as they had before, but they were on. The hum of the generators, the soft mechanical whirring, was almost comforting. Inside, the survivors were there, just as they had left them. Huddled together, anxious but alive, they looked up at Alex and Ethan as they entered. There were no words at first, just faces, tired, drawn, but alive. Some looked as though they'd been waiting for this moment, the moment of hope that Alex had promised them, the moment when the light would return, when they could finally stop running. Alex's gaze moved across the room, and she saw the people she had fought for, the people she had nearly lost. Some of them had changed in subtle ways. Their eyes were harder, their faces older, their spirits broken, but they were still here. They hadn't given up. Neither had she. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, until Alex broke it. The power's back on. The city will have light again. Ethan stepped forward, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed the exhaustion that had seeped into his bones. We've still got a long way to go. It's not over. Alex nodded, her eyes scanning the room, feeling the weight of the truth in his words. The battle wasn't over. But for the first time in weeks, there was a flicker of something else. Something that had been buried deep inside her. Something she had almost forgotten. Hope. It was fragile, like a small ember in the wind, but it was there. And maybe that was enough. She moved toward the group, her heart beating in her chest as she looked at them. "We've lost a lot," she began, her voice cracking slightly, "but we're still here. And as long as we're here, we keep fighting. We rebuild. We face whatever comes next. Together." A murmur of agreement passed through the room, the survivors shifting closer to one another. There was no grand speech, no promises that everything would be okay. Alex didn't have those words, but she had this, the quiet strength of those who had survived when there was no reason to. Ethan stepped up beside her, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They didn't need to say anything more. Alex turned back to the room, to the faces that looked at her with a mixture of trust and weariness. There were so many things left to do, so many battles yet to fight. But for the first time in a long time, Alex felt the weight of the world shift just slightly. She wasn't alone, and tomorrow would come. With or without the light, with or without the city, there was something to fight for. There was still a chance. As she stood there with the survivors around her, Alex made her decision. She wouldn't leave. She wouldn't run. She would help rebuild, help fight, help whatever was left of humanity stand tall in the face of the coming darkness. The world outside was broken, but inside, in this hospital, in this small piece of a dying city, Alex knew that the fight had only just begun. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.